I had always seen him only as a stranger, as a stepfather who simply exists in my life. But suddenly everything changed. He, the same man whom I never perceived as a father, suddenly became my support. His words are like a blow, like a cold shower. It's as if he sees nothing but his feelings, and now I'm standing on the edge. How did this happen? How did we end up here? And here, the climax. Everything is coming to the moment when we have a choice, and I understand that he will change everything. What will happen next? Will I be able to go back? Emily had always felt a sense of emotional distance from her stepfather, Kevin. From the very beginning of their living arrangement, there had always been an unspoken divide between them. Kevin, though polite and respectful, never seemed to cross that invisible line into being something more than a figurehead in her life. She never felt the bond a daughter should feel with her father, even though Kevin had been married to her mother for several years. To Emily, Kevin was a stranger, a man who was more of an outsider in their home than a true member of the family. Despite the time they spent under the same roof, they never really connected. Their conversations were brief, often centered around the mundane. Emily was never really sure what Kevin thought of her, but from the way he interacted with her, it seemed clear that he didn't think much about her at all. He was a man of few words, with a calm demeanor that could easily be misinterpreted as indifference. But that all began to change when Emily's world was suddenly turned upside down by a breakup with her boyfriend. She hadn't expected it to hurt as much as it did. They had been together for over a year, and although she had known for a while that they weren't right for each other, breaking up still left her feeling empty and alone. Her mind was filled with questions she couldn't answer, and the sadness was all-consuming. What had gone wrong? Could she have done something different? Could she have saved the relationship? These thoughts replayed over and over in her head, creating a cloud of confusion and pain. The truth was, Emily had been feeling more and more isolated in the aftermath of her breakup. Her friends were all in relationships, busy with their own lives. They couldn't offer the kind of support Emily desperately needed. She found herself retreating into herself, spending more time alone in her room or wandering the house. It was then, when she least expected it, that Kevin seemed to notice something was wrong. Emily was sitting on the couch one evening, eyes lost in the flickering television screen but not really watching it, when Kevin walked into the living room. She didn't expect him to say anything to her. He never did, but this time was different. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her quietly, as if debating something in his mind. "Emily," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak to her in that way. She turned to face him, her heart racing slightly. He had never approached her with such concern before. "I can see that you're going through a tough time," he continued, his voice low and calm. "If you want to talk, I'm here for you. I know I'm not the easiest person to talk to, but you don't have to go through this alone." Emily froze, the words catching her off guard. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate his offer, it was more that she had never expected him to acknowledge her pain. Kevin had always been a distant figure in her life, a man she had never truly seen as part of her world. But now, there he was, offering his support. It was almost too much to process. "Thanks," she said quietly, unsure of how to react. "I appreciate it." Her voice came out softer than she intended, a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. Kevin gave a small nod and then turned to leave the room. But before he stepped away, he hesitated for a moment and looked back at her. "I mean it, Emily," he said. "If you ever need to talk, don't hesitate to come to me. I know things might be awkward between us, but I want to help. You don't have to carry this alone." Emily was left sitting there, stunned. Kevin had always been emotionally distant, and yet now, here he was, offering something she never thought he would, a listening ear, a sense of concern. It was something she hadn't experienced from him in the years they had lived together. For the first time, Emily felt a flicker of hope that maybe Kevin wasn't as detached as he seemed. Maybe, deep down, he cared. She wasn't sure what to make of this new side of him. The thought made her feel both grateful and uneasy. She had spent so much time thinking of him as a distant figure, someone who didn't have any emotional investment in her life. But now, his words made her wonder if there was more to him than she had originally thought. As the days passed, Emily found herself thinking about that conversation more and more. She had never been close to Kevin, but for the first time, she felt like there might be a chance for them to connect on a deeper level. She started noticing small things, his quiet acts of kindness, his attempts to make her feel comfortable in their home. Kevin wasn't the type to show much emotion, but she could sense a change in the way he interacted with her. He began making small gestures, like asking if she needed anything from the store or offering to help her with something around the house. At first, she was hesitant to accept his help, unsure if she could let her guard down around him. But as time went on, Emily found herself responding to his attempts to connect. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "How's school going?" Kevin asked one evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, both of them quietly eating dinner. Emily looked up at him, surprised by the question. He had never shown much interest in her studies before. "It's okay, I guess," she replied, glancing down at her plate. "I'm just trying to get through the semester." Kevin nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer, but there was a look in his eyes that told her he wasn't just asking out of politeness. He was genuinely trying to engage with her, and for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a small sense of comfort in the fact that he was willing to reach out, even if it was only in the smallest of ways. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Kevin began talking more. They would have brief conversations in the mornings over coffee or chat about their day while watching TV. Their relationship was still far from perfect, but it was changing. Emily began to realize that perhaps there was more to Kevin than she had ever seen. He wasn't just her stepfather, he was a man with his own experiences, his own life, and now, maybe, he was becoming someone she could trust. Over the next few weeks, Emily began to notice a subtle shift in her relationship with Kevin. What had started as small attempts at conversation began to grow into something more. The once uncomfortable silences between them now felt more manageable, and they found themselves talking more often. Kevin would check in with her, asking how her day had gone, or offering to help with whatever task she was working on. His gestures were small but meaningful, and for the first time, Emily began to see him in a different light. It wasn't just that Kevin was being kind, it was the fact that he seemed to be genuinely trying to understand her. Emily had spent so much of her life feeling like an outsider in her own home, but now, for the first time, Kevin was making an effort to bridge that gap. It was still awkward, and there were moments when Emily wasn't sure how to respond to his attempts, but she began to realize that their relationship didn't have to stay as distant as it had been. One afternoon, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the textbook in front of her. She had been trying to study, but her mind kept drifting back to her recent breakup. The pain was still fresh, and every time she tried to focus on her schoolwork, memories of her ex flooded her mind. It was exhausting, and she was finding it hard to concentrate. Kevin walked into the room, holding a cup of coffee in his hands. "You look like you're having a rough time," he said, setting the coffee down in front of her. "How's the studying going?" Emily sighed and rubbed her eyes. "It's not going well," she admitted. "I just can't concentrate. I keep thinking about everything that happened, and I can't shake it." Kevin nodded, his expression softening. "I understand," he said quietly. "I know how hard it can be to move on from something like that. It takes time." Emily was surprised by his words. She had never imagined Kevin could understand what she was going through. He had always seemed like such an emotionally distant figure in her life, and yet now, he was offering something that she never expected from him: empathy. "I didn't expect you to understand," Emily said, looking up at him. "You've never really seemed like the type of person to care about things like that." Kevin paused for a moment, and then he sat down across from her at the table. "I may not always show it," he said, his voice thoughtful, "but I do care. I may not have always been there for you the way you wanted, but I'm trying to do better. I don't want you to feel like you're alone in this." Emily felt a flicker of something inside her. It wasn't just relief, it was something deeper, something that stirred within her. She hadn't expected Kevin to reach out to her like this, and it made her realize just how much she had underestimated him. All these years, she had seen him as cold and distant, but now, she was beginning to see him as a person in his own right. A person who, despite his quiet nature, had something valuable to offer. "I didn't think you cared," Emily said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can see now that maybe I was wrong." Kevin smiled faintly, a look of understanding in his eyes. "It's easy to misunderstand people, especially when you're used to seeing them a certain way. I guess I've never really been good at opening up either, but I'm trying now. For you." Emily didn't know what to say to that. She had spent so much time pushing him away, convinced that he would never understand her. But now, for the first time, she felt like she was seeing a side of Kevin she hadn't seen before. There was more to him than the quiet, distant figure she had always kept at arm's length. As the weeks passed, they continued to share more of their lives with each other. They would talk about their days, their thoughts, their struggles. Kevin began to open up about his own past, sharing stories from his youth, and Emily found herself listening intently, surprised by how much they had in common. Kevin's stories weren't always happy ones, but they showed her a side of him that was real and vulnerable. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Kevin spoke about his early years, before he had met Emily's mother. "I wasn't always the man you see now," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I had my share of mistakes and regrets. I know I'm not perfect, and I don't expect you to think that I am. But I do the best I can." Emily nodded slowly, processing his words. "I know," she said quietly. "I guess I've just been so focused on my own problems that I never stopped to think about yours." Kevin looked at her with a faint smile. "It's easy to get lost in your own struggles," he said. "But it's also important to remember that we're all dealing with something. Nobody has it all figured out." Emily thought about that for a moment. It was true. She had spent so much time feeling sorry for herself, focusing on her own heartbreak, that she hadn't considered the challenges Kevin might have faced. Maybe he wasn't as emotionally distant as she had always thought. Maybe, just maybe, he was trying to reach out to her in his own way. "Thanks for listening," Emily said, her voice sincere. "I never thought I'd be able to talk to you about this stuff." Kevin smiled softly. "You don't have to thank me. I'm glad we're finally able to talk like this." The more they spoke, the more Emily realized that her perception of Kevin was changing. He wasn't the cold, distant man she had always thought he was. He was a man with his own history, his own emotions, and his own struggles. And, just like her, he was doing his best to navigate life. For the first time, Emily felt like she was connecting with Kevin, not just as her stepfather, but as someone who understood her, someone who could relate to her pain and offer comfort. It was a strange feeling, one she hadn't expected to experience, but it was also a relief. Maybe things between them didn't have to be as awkward as she had thought. As the days turned into weeks, the dynamic between Emily and Kevin continued to evolve in ways neither of them could have predicted. What had begun as tentative attempts at conversation, born from a place of empathy and shared pain, had slowly blossomed into something more. They spent more time together, both naturally gravitating toward each other as a source of comfort and understanding. Conversations about their lives, their pasts, and their challenges became more frequent, more meaningful. It wasn't just the typical small talk anymore. They were opening up to one another in ways that felt personal and real. Kevin, though reserved by nature, had started to share more of his experiences with Emily. He spoke about his childhood, his early adult years, and even the struggles he'd faced before meeting her mother. Emily, in turn, found herself opening up more than she had ever expected, revealing her insecurities, her pain, and her confusion about the breakup. She was vulnerable around him in a way she hadn't been with anyone else, and there was a certain comfort in that. For the first time in a long while, Emily didn't feel completely alone. But as their connection deepened, so did the complexity of their feelings. Emily couldn't ignore the subtle shifts in her emotions. It wasn't just gratitude she was beginning to feel toward Kevin anymore. It was something more intense, more confusing. She found herself thinking about him more often, not just as a source of support, but as a man she couldn't quite shake from her mind. It was strange, unsettling, and yet undeniable. She tried to push the thoughts away, convincing herself it was just the emotional turbulence of her breakup clouding her judgment. But deep down, Emily knew something had changed. Kevin, too, began to notice the subtle shift in their relationship. He could feel the growing tension in the air, the way their interactions had changed. His feelings for Emily, though not fully understood, were beginning to evolve into something more than just paternal care. He wasn't naive. He could tell that Emily was changing, and the way she looked at him was different now. He noticed the lingering glances, the softer tone of her voice, and the way she seemed to seek out his company more often. It was hard to ignore, but Kevin also recognized the danger of those feelings. This wasn't right. He was her stepfather, and what was beginning to blossom between them wasn't something he could allow to continue. There were moments, though, when the air between them was thick with unspoken words. When Kevin caught Emily's gaze lingering a little longer than usual, or when her hand brushed against his in a way that felt more intimate than accidental. It was as if they were both walking a tightrope, balancing between a newfound closeness and the overwhelming weight of boundaries that should never be crossed. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, the silence between them felt more loaded than it ever had before. They had been talking about Emily's plans for the future, her struggles with her studies and her desire to move on from the past, but something in the way they were looking at each other made it hard for either of them to focus. The comfortable, easy rapport they had built over the past few weeks suddenly felt strained, and neither of them knew how to navigate it. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, glancing at Kevin out of the corner of her eye. She wasn't sure why, but there was a tension in her chest, a flutter in her stomach that had nothing to do with her earlier conversations. Her thoughts were clouded, and the emotions she had been trying to suppress seemed to rise to the surface. She wanted to say something, but she couldn't find the words. The more she tried to focus on something else, the more she realized that she was acutely aware of Kevin sitting next to her, the proximity of their bodies making her uneasy in a way that she couldn't explain. Kevin, too, was feeling the shift. His mind raced with thoughts of how things had gotten here. He had never intended for their relationship to change, let alone become complicated. He had tried to offer support, to be there for her in her time of need. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. Kevin wasn't sure what to do with the feelings that had begun to stir inside him. He had always been a man who valued boundaries, who believed in keeping a certain emotional distance from others. But now, sitting next to Emily, he felt that distance closing, and it frightened him. He glanced over at her, his eyes meeting hers, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the silence was almost suffocating. Kevin opened his mouth to say something, anything, to break the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, they both sat there, caught in a moment that neither of them had the courage to address. Emily's pulse quickened as she noticed how close they were. His scent, the warmth of his body beside hers, it was all too much. She wanted to move, to escape the feeling of being trapped in this charged space, but she couldn't. She was frozen, unsure of what to do or how to react. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions, and for the first time in weeks, she felt truly unsettled. Finally, Kevin broke the silence. "I think maybe we should both get some rest," he said, his voice strained, as if he were struggling to keep himself together. "It's been a long day." Emily nodded quickly, grateful for the excuse to leave the room. "Yeah, I think you're right," she said, her voice sounding more distant than she intended. She stood up, her legs slightly shaky, and quickly made her way to her room, the weight of the moment lingering in her mind. As she closed the door behind her and collapsed onto her bed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. That brief, silent exchange had altered the dynamic between them, and she wasn't sure if it was a good or bad change. She wanted to push the feelings away, to tell herself that it was just the result of her vulnerability and emotional turmoil. But deep down, she knew that something had shifted, something that would make everything more complicated from this point forward. The days that followed felt increasingly difficult for Emily. What had once been a sense of calm understanding with Kevin was now tainted by a growing tension that neither of them knew how to handle. Their conversations, which had once felt natural and comforting, now carried an undercurrent of unspoken words, of emotions that were bubbling just below the surface. Emily tried to push those feelings away, but they lingered, occupying her thoughts in a way she couldn't ignore. Kevin, too, seemed to sense the change. His usual composure had slipped, and his interactions with Emily had become more guarded. Every time they spoke, he was acutely aware of the subtle shifts in their relationship. Every glance, every touch, every moment spent together seemed to carry more weight than it had before. Kevin was conflicted, torn between the desire to be there for Emily and the overwhelming need to keep their relationship appropriate. But the closer they became, the harder it was to ignore the growing attraction that he felt toward her. It was something he knew was wrong, but it didn't make the feelings go away. One evening, Emily found herself in the living room, sitting in the same spot on the couch where she had spent countless hours talking with Kevin. But tonight, it felt different. The space between them seemed to have shrunk, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of his presence beside her. He had been quieter than usual, and Emily could tell that he was holding something back. "Kevin," she said softly, breaking the silence. She wasn't sure what she wanted to say, but the silence between them had become too heavy. "Are you okay? You've been distant lately." Kevin glanced over at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice lacked its usual steadiness. "Just tired, I guess." Emily nodded, but she didn't believe him. She had grown used to his usual calm demeanor, and she could tell that something was different. "It's not just that," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You've been acting different, like you're holding something back." Kevin's gaze faltered for a moment, and he turned away, staring out the window. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Emily felt the knot in her stomach tighten. She had to know what was going on, had to understand why Kevin was pulling away. Finally, Kevin sighed, his shoulders tense. "I've been trying to figure things out," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know things have been changing between us, and I don't know what to do about it." Emily's heart raced at his words. She had been feeling the same confusion, the same growing tension between them. She had tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just her emotions getting in the way, but now, hearing Kevin acknowledge it, she felt a sense of validation. "You mean, what's happening between us?" Emily asked cautiously, her voice barely audible. She didn't want to say the words out loud, but they hung in the air between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Kevin looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know how to explain it," he said quietly, "but lately, I've been feeling for things that I shouldn't be feeling." Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. She knew exactly what he meant. She had felt it too. The attraction, the pull toward him that was becoming impossible to ignore. It terrified her. It was wrong. It was something that shouldn't even be there. And yet, the more she tried to suppress it, the more it grew. "I don't know what to do either," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. "I can't stop thinking about it, Kevin. I keep telling myself it's just the breakup, that it's just me being emotional and confused. But I know it's more than that." Kevin's face softened, and for a moment, he looked almost regretful. "I never wanted this to happen," he said, his voice full of guilt. "I never wanted to make you feel this way, and I certainly never wanted to make things more complicated than they already are. But I can't deny it anymore. There's something between us, something that shouldn't be there." The room felt like it was closing in on Emily. She wanted to run, to escape from this moment, but she couldn't. She was stuck, trapped in the very feelings that both terrified and intrigued her. She could see the same confusion in Kevin's eyes, the same struggle to come to terms with what was happening between them, but neither of them knew what to do next. For a long moment, they sat in silence, both of them struggling with their emotions. The bond they had been forming had shifted, and now, it was a complicated mess of guilt, desire, and confusion. Neither of them could deny the connection that had formed between them, but neither knew how to move forward without crossing a line they both knew they shouldn't cross. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to hurt my mom. But I don't know how to stop feeling this way." Kevin reached out, his hand hovering near hers. For a moment, he hesitated, but then, slowly, he placed his hand on top of hers. The touch was brief, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her, and Emily could feel her pulse quicken. She wanted to pull away, to tell him that it wasn't right, but she didn't. Instead, she left her hand there, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. "Neither do I," Kevin said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I think we both need to take a step back. We can't let this go any further." Emily nodded, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe him, wanted to convince herself that they could just pretend none of this had happened. But deep down, she knew it was impossible to turn back now. The feelings were there, and they weren't going away. The days that followed were filled with confusion and unease. Emily couldn't get Kevin's words out of her head. The quiet acknowledgement of the tension between them had left her feeling exposed, like she had just stepped into a world that was both forbidden and enticing. Every time she saw Kevin, the weight of their unspoken feelings pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to focus on anything else. Kevin, too, seemed to be struggling. He was more distant now, more withdrawn, as though he was trying to distance himself from the emotional mess they had created between them. But Emily couldn't help but feel his presence in every corner of the house. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. Every glance, every fleeting touch, left her wondering if he was thinking the same things she was. If he was feeling the same pull, the same desire to cross the line they both knew they shouldn't. It was on one of those quiet evenings, when the house was empty except for the two of them, that the tension reached its breaking point. Emily was in the kitchen, trying to distract herself by cooking dinner, but her mind was far from the task at hand. She couldn't stop thinking about Kevin, the way he had touched her hand that night, the way his eyes had searched hers, as though trying to find a way to explain something neither of them could put into words. Kevin entered the kitchen, his footsteps quiet as he approached. "Dinner's almost ready," he asked, his voice casual, but there was something in the way he said it, something that made Emily's heart race. "Yeah," she replied, forcing a smile, "just putting the finishing touches on it." She tried to focus on the vegetables in front of her, trying to ignore the growing unease in her stomach. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet in the room felt suffocating, each second passing as though it were an eternity. Emily could feel Kevin standing there, just a few feet behind her, and the space between them seemed to shrink with every passing moment. She wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, Kevin broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emily, we can't keep doing this. We can't keep pretending like nothing's going on between us." Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She slowly turned to face him, her breath catching in her throat. "Kevin," she started, but her voice faltered. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to this. Kevin took a step forward, his eyes locked onto hers. I've been thinking about what you said, about what's happening between us. And I can't pretend it's not there anymore. But I also know it's wrong. We can't let this go any further." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her in a rush of emotions. She felt a surge of relief mixed with regret. She had been hoping that Kevin would be the one to put an end to this, to stop the dangerous pull they felt toward each other. But now that the words were out in the open, everything felt even more complicated. "I don't know what to do," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't stop thinking about you. I keep telling myself that it's just because I'm vulnerable, but I don't think it's just that." Kevin reached out, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I know," he said softly. "I've felt it too. But that doesn't make it right. We can't let this thing between us continue, Emily. It's dangerous. It's wrong." But Emily wasn't sure if she could stop. The feelings she had for him had grown too strong, too overwhelming. It wasn't just a passing attraction. It was something deeper, something that had been building ever since they started to spend more time together. She could see it in Kevin's eyes too, the same confusion, the same desire to ignore the boundaries they both knew they shouldn't cross. "How do we stop it?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "How do we just walk away from this, from what we've been feeling?" Kevin's hand dropped from her shoulder, and he stepped back, his expression filled with regret. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I don't know how we stop it, but we have to try. For both of us. We can't let this go any further." Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to tell him that she couldn't do it, that she couldn't just ignore the feelings that had become so real to her. But the words wouldn't come. She wanted to believe that Kevin was right, that they could just walk away from this strange, forbidden connection between them. But deep down, she wasn't sure if she could let it go. Kevin seemed to sense her inner turmoil. He took a step back and shook his head, his expression pained. "Emily, you're like a daughter to me," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I can't let myself do this. I can't let myself cross that line. But I can't ignore how I feel about you either." His words hung in the air like a weight, suffocating both of them. Emily didn't know what to say. She wanted to tell him that she understood, that she didn't want to hurt him or anyone else. But she didn't know if she could go back to pretending like nothing had happened between them. Kevin turned away from her, his back to her as he walked toward the door. "I think it's best if we both take some space," he said, his voice strained. "I think we need to step away from each other for a while, to let everything settle." Emily didn't respond. She watched him leave the room, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. The moment they had shared, the tension that had built between them, it had all come to a head, and now, it seemed like everything was unraveling. She stood in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where Kevin had just been. The silence felt louder now, more oppressive. She didn't know what to do, where to go from here. She had never expected things to get this complicated. But now that they had, Emily wasn't sure how to untangle the mess of emotions that had been stirred up. The days after that night felt like a blur to Emily. She tried to continue with her daily routine, but the weight of what had happened between her and Kevin hung over her like a dark cloud. She couldn't stop thinking about the tension, the words they had exchanged, and the way their connection had suddenly become so much more complicated. She was confused, hurt, and uncertain of what to do next. Kevin, too, had been distant. His attempts to pull away from her were clear. He had stopped initiating conversations, and the moments they had spent together in the past seemed like a distant memory. His behavior only added to the turmoil inside Emily. She felt like she was losing the only person who had been there for her in recent weeks, the person she had started to trust, even though it was complicated. Every time they crossed paths, the air between them grew thicker. Emily could feel the unspoken words, the emotional distance that had crept in after their confession. Kevin tried to pretend everything was fine, but it was clear that both of them were struggling to reconcile their feelings with the reality of their situation. One evening, after a long day of studying, Emily was sitting in her room, trying to focus on her work. But it was impossible to concentrate. Every time she glanced at the door, she half expected Kevin to walk in and start one of their usual conversations. But he didn't. It had been days since they last spoke openly. She was left alone with her thoughts, and the weight of her emotions was starting to feel unbearable. Suddenly, there was a knock on her door. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. Without thinking, she quickly stood up and opened it. There, standing in the doorway, was Kevin. His expression was unreadable, and his posture was tense, as if he had been standing there for a while, unsure of whether or not to knock. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly, his voice hoarse. Emily didn't know how to respond at first. She had been avoiding this conversation for days, but now, here it was, standing in front of her. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. "Of course," she said, stepping back to let him in. Her voice came out softer than she had intended. Kevin entered the room, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily's pulse was racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was about to happen would change everything between them. Perhaps for good. Finally, Kevin broke the silence. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," he began, his voice steady but filled with regret. "About us, about what we've both been feeling. And I know I can't just pretend it didn't happen. I know that we've crossed a line, and it's not something I can easily forget." Emily nodded slowly, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "I don't know what to do with all this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to make sense of what we've both been feeling. I keep telling myself it's just a reaction to my breakup, but I can't ignore it anymore." Kevin took a deep breath, clearly struggling with his own emotions. "I don't know what this is, Emily," he said, his voice shaky, "but I do know that it can't continue. It's not right. And I can't be the one to keep pushing us down this path, even if I feel what I feel." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. She had known, deep down, that they couldn't keep going on like this. But hearing Kevin say it out loud made it feel even more final. The clarity in his voice cut through her like a knife, and she felt the sting of reality. What they had shared, what they had both allowed to happen, could never be allowed to continue. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Emily said, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't want to hurt you, and I don't want to hurt my mom. But I don't know how to stop feeling this way." Kevin stepped closer, his gaze filled with sadness. "I don't want to hurt anyone either," he said softly. "But I know that if we keep going down this path, we're going to hurt a lot of people. Most of all, ourselves." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with unsaid words and emotions that neither of them knew how to handle. Emily's chest ached with the intensity of what they were both feeling. She didn't know how to let go of the desire that had been growing inside her, the pull she had felt toward him. But Kevin was right. It couldn't continue. "Maybe it's best if we take some time apart," Kevin said, his voice low. "Maybe we both need space to figure things out. I need to stop letting this, whatever this is, influence my actions. And you need to heal. We both need to move forward. But we can't keep pretending like nothing has changed." Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She nodded, though she felt as if her heart was breaking in two. "I agree," she whispered. "I don't want to keep hurting everyone around me, especially not you." Kevin reached out then, his hand hovering in the air for a moment before he placed it gently on her shoulder. "This isn't the end, Emily," he said quietly, "but it has to be the end of this." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. She knew he was right. It was over, whatever it had been. And as much as it hurt to acknowledge it, she also knew it was for the best. They both needed to move on, to put this behind them and focus on what truly mattered, their family, their lives, their futures. "I'll give you the space you need," Kevin said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll give you time to heal, but you need to do the same for yourself." "We both do." Emily nodded, wiping away a tear. "Thank you, Kevin," she said softly. "Thank you for understanding." Kevin stepped back, giving her space. For a moment, they just stood there, the weight of everything that had happened between them settling in. As Kevin left the room, Emily closed the door behind him, feeling the immense weight lift slightly from her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe again. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a new beginning, and maybe that was enough for now.